Hello, everyone. My name is Deborah DeBruin, and I direct the Center for Bioethics here at the University of Minnesota. And I'm delighted to welcome you to what is the last session in this academic year's Ethics Grand Round series. We're really delighted to be able to host Dr. Jennifer Tsai today. But before I introduce our speaker to you, I'd like to just talk about some logistics and housekeeping matters for today's event. So I'll begin with a disclaimer. The views expressed by webinar speakers are always their own and do not necessarily reflect those of individual Center for Bioethics faculty. The center itself does not take positions on specific issues, and the hosting or posting online of a webinar does not imply any endorsement of any views expressed by the speakers. Thank you. So to the logistics. If you have any questions at all today, please use the Q&A function. That is to say, if you have questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A function and feel free to input those into the Q&A at any time. You don't have to wait till the end of the talk to do it, although we will wait until the end of her remarks to raise the questions. If you have any questions for center staff, about technical issues or whatever, please also use the Q&A function. Center for Bioethics staff will be monitoring it and responding appropriately. Today's event is being recorded, and shortly after the event is over, the recording will be posted to our YouTube page, and you can see the link there on the screen. Captions are enabled for today's event. So if you click on captions and then show captions, they should appear if you'd like to have captions for today's talk. We are really interested in hearing your feedback on today's event, on all our events. And as you can see, there are a number of ways that you can access the evaluation. First, it'll pop up in your web browser after the event. It's linked in the presentation details document, which you can find in the chat. A lot of information about today's event is going to be in that presentation details document, so you will hear me mention it a number of times. You'll also receive an email after the event with a link that will allow you to complete the evaluation, or you can scan the QR code on your screen and access it now. Next slide, please. There are a number of ways to get credit for today's event. If you would like to request a certificate of attendance for continuing ed credits, please complete the form that's linked in the presentation details document, which again is in the chat, or you can scan that QR code. Please note that requests for certificates have to be submitted within 1 week of the event in order for our staff to be able to manage the workload of processing all those requests for certificates. So after 1 week, the request form will be closed and no further submissions will be accepted. University of Minnesota health profession students who would like IPE or interprofessional education credit can complete the reflection form that's linked in the presentation details document. Biomedical engineering students, you can follow the instructions for seeking credits in your Canvas course site. And for all of the above, the requirements are that you attend 75% of today's webinar in order to receive credit. Next slide, please. I would very much like to thank our co-sponsors. We are very lucky to have such wonderful partners as we work to organize our event series for you. You can see the list of co-sponsors on your screen there. I'll just give you a moment to take a look at them. We're very grateful for their partnership. Next slide, please. And without further ado, I would very, very much like to introduce to you Dr. Jennifer Tsai. She is an emergency medicine physician practicing at Kaiser, and she is also a faculty member in the Joint Medical Program at UCFS and UC Berkeley. There are so many things that I could say about her wonderful career. You will find a longer bio linked in that presentation details document in the chat. But without further ado, because I know we are all eager to hear from her, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Tsai.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate the number of people who are registered, who are taking time to be here with us. I know there's so many things that pull at our interest, and the fact that we get to talk about something really important to me does not uh, feel light to me. It feels really meaningful. So today I'm going to be focusing on the issue of race in medicine, especially about how race has been operationalized as a biologic concept in a way that's problematic, in a way that informs and changes medical education, practice, and philosophy kind of overall. One of the main points that I want to make sure to sort of hammer home is that the ways that we imagine and we utilize definitions of race are very linked to our understanding of racial disparities, health equity, and the tools we have to recognize solutions. I have no disclosures to report. As a little bit of a presentation roadmap, we will give a little bit of context about race as a concept, discuss race as it relates to health inequities, and we'll look at some examples of how race is mobilized in medical education and some of the problematic aspects of that utilization. I want to touch on the politics of color consciousness, the ways that we're paying attention to these differences in ways that can be both helpful and harmful. I'm hopeful the presentation should be around 45 minutes and we'll leave the rest for discussion, which I'll be really excited to see what we'll talk about. To begin, I want to bring in a quote written by author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. In her best-selling book, Americana, she writes, "They tell us race is an invention, that there is more genetic variation between Black people than there are between a Black person and a white person. Then they tell us Black people have a worse kind of breast cancer and get more fibroids, and white folk get cystic fibrosis and osteoporosis. So what's the deal, doctors in the house? Is race an invention or not?" So race seems to matter in medicine. In 1993, the National Institutes of Health passed the Revitalization Act, which required data on racial minorities and women to be included in all clinical research. And the problem is that while this Revitalization Act now requires and required scientific research to include racial categories, very few scientists and doctors have actually studied the complexities of racial politics in the United States. So, though physicians are ill-equipped and not at all trained in racial formation theories, they are actually huge players in creating public understanding about race as well as its definitions. But as a Dr. Hunt writes, although race is indeed a prominent category in medical research, education, and practice guidelines, it remains a black box concept. Race is a vague and undefined construct, and thus clinicians are thus left to their own cultural understanding and assumptions in interpreting racial difference. Right? So to understand how we should use race in the clinic, we first have to answer this very fundamental question. What is race? Well, according to the US Census, this woman would be considered Caucasian. These two women are twins, as are these two toddlers shown here with their biological parents. Dorothy Roberts is a Black legal scholar who writes often about race. She makes the point of describing herself as a Black woman with a white father rather than a white woman with a Black mother. And these are essentially two sides of the same exact coin. But why does one of those seem to make so much more sense to us? If we look at these women's race as it is used in clinical research, we would group them into a single patient subset, Hispanic or Latina women, and make assumptions about what that might mean for their care. But these women are from Mexico, Italy, Colombia, Puerto Rico, and Spain. And so it brings us to this point. Race itself is not a robust biologic category. It's really important to understand that genetic variation is continuous and overlapping among populations. And yet, medical discourse, our research, we often treat racial groups as discrete, immutable, and genetically homogeneous. In reality, it's much more accurate to visualize the idea of genetic variation using a spectrum that mimics gradual clinal variation. But even still, understanding of clinal variation and genetic diversity is not enough to define and reproduce our notions of race, all the ways that we use it, all the ways that it's infused with meaning. In actuality, racial categories in the US are sociopolitically constructed and therefore dynamic, fluid, and transient. Racial categories in the US Census, for example, have changed every decade since 1790. And I think looking closer at this evolution helps us really clearly dismantle the biologic idea of race. In 1790, the racial categories used in the US Census included slaves, free white males and females, and all other free persons. In 1890, the census included a category for Native Americans, representing the government's first attempt to catalog American Indians, Chinese, Japanese, due to a rapid influx of migrant workers, specifically from Eastern Asia, white, and a Black subcategory that included distinctions for mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon. And these are terms that we do not use anymore that denote people who are 1/2, 1/4, or 1/8 Black. These labels were very specifically born from anxieties around racial purity along the idea of the one-drop rule, which was heavily mobilized in conversations around legal citizenship and therefore legal rights. In 1896, the landmark case of Plessy v. Ferguson declared the jurisdiction of separate but equal. But we forget that at the initiation of this legal battle, a major argument of Homer Plessy's was the fact that as a free man and as an octoroon, he was actually white. The court decided if Plessy were a white man, he had a valid case, but if he were determined to be a colored man, he actually had no right to legal action from the beginning. In 1913, Sarah Rector, a Black girl who became a millionaire as a preteen, became so wealthy that the state of Oklahoma actually declared her to be a white person. So history shows us how important it was for courts to determine who was white and who was not. Race was a legal definition, not a matter of genes or internal construction. 100 years after the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, the US Census expanded to include a greater number of nationalities. This included broad swaths that we recognize from medical research. And so our understanding and the official lines of race have been drawn and redrawn over and over again based on shifting understanding of citizenship, blood, respectability, heritability, and color. And this isn't because of new biologic data or genetic discovery. Race is quite demonstrably a government-produced category instead of a static genomic entity. Studies have demonstrated that genetic differences are statistically higher within racial groups than between racial groups. And it feels a little bit counterintuitive, but there is indeed statistically less genetic overlap between two unrelated Black patients in a clinic waiting room than between one of those Black patients and a white neighbor. To be clear, because I think this can be confusing at times, we learn often in our medical education about ancestral alleles, and these alleles absolutely can affect disease rates, pharmaceutical efficacy. They are risk factors that make us prone to certain diseases. But these alleles do not align neatly with commonly used racial groupings. And again, this is very important. Reductive race categories cannot be substituted for genetic ancestry, and indeed are poor proxies for biologic markers. Our understanding of race is not a good indication for family history. Add to this the consideration that in studies, physicians inaccurately classified the race of over 50% of their patients. It becomes clearer that physician evaluation of skin color phenotype as a part of clinical decision-making seeks to make medical decisions off of decidedly non-scientific metrics. To be clear, this is not to say race does not matter. Race has a profound impact on health. The impact, however, is not necessarily written into DNA, but engendered through social inequities caused by a legacy of discriminatory institutions in this country. Every year, more than 100,000 Black men, women, and children die because their mortality rates do not equal that of their white counterparts. The statistic means that if disease and mortality rates for Black people were the same as they are for white people, we would stop the equivalent of a jumbo jet carrying 260 people from crashing every single day. We see staggering disparities in heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, severity, mortality, and it really brings up this question: why does being a person of color cause poor health outcomes? Well, racism is a massive driver of health inequity, a concept defined by the WHO as the consequence of the unequal distribution of political, socioeconomic, and environmental resources that are required for health. So consider how each of these avenues begets health disparities. 1 in 13 Black men are disenfranchised. This is directly related to the fact that despite rates of similar drug use, Black men are 12 times more likely to be arrested for drug offenses compared to whites. Recent data from the Chetty et al. Equality of Opportunity Project shows that at any given time, more than 20% of Black boys in the lowest income rank are incarcerated. This is a scatter plot. I don't think we should be able to look at this chart without being emotionally affected, and I feel myself being emotionally affected. At any moment, one of 5 Black boys in the lowest income rank live in a cage. I used to teach a course on prisoner health and advocacy at Blackstone Academy Charter School in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And in one session, we had a very similar discussion. We projected the same statistic on the screens. And we talked about how 1 in 3 Black men born before 1999 will go to prison in their lifetime. And at the end of class, one of my students touched my elbow. He pushed up his glasses and he said, "Miss Jenny, I was born in 2002. That means I'll be okay, right? You talked about 1999." My student was arrested in 2018, and I know that his entire future looks different now. And so when I see this scatter plot, I really think it should take something out of us. It represents an overwhelming amount of suffering. In parts of the South, mass incarceration has rendered rates of disenfranchisement that surpass Jim Crow era levels. This serves as a potent mechanism for limiting the ability of Black communities to advocate for their needs. And in fact, the US now imprisons a larger percentage of its Black population than South Africa did during apartheid. In Chicago, contact tracing revealed that a full almost 20% of novel coronavirus cases could be traced to Cook County Jail. So how do we understand state violence to be a part of healthcare inequity, especially given the fact that in some regions of our country, a prisoner will die every 7 days due to inadequate medical care? On a socioeconomic level, healthcare access in this country is heavily dependent on what you can afford. So while recent statistics show that the median Black-white income gap itself is large, around 60,000 for whites compared to 35,000 for Blacks, the median wealth gap is startling at 91,405 for whites and around 6,500 for Blacks. The median wealth of white households is almost 14 times that of Black households. And this gap is not changing. In fact, in some statistics, it's actually widening. According to a report from 2010, the median wealth for a single white woman is $41,500. The median wealth for a single Black woman is $100. If we consider the economic analysis that nearly 50% of the median homeowner's wealth comes from the value of their property, we have to go back and analyze how Black families were denied home ownership under discriminatory policies from the New Deal era. In the 1930s, the Federal Housing Association financed 60% of all American homes, and yet less than 2% of these loans went to people of color. Black neighborhoods were routinely redlined and coded for mortgage default, stranding Black families in poorly resourced neighborhoods without means for migration. This is an archival map of Boston. By the coding of the time, green was valued as best, blue still desirable, yellow declining, and red hazardous. This was about denying and restricting services to residents of a particular area based on racial and ethnic composition. And this cordoning off of different groups of people is foundational to government-sponsored racial segregation, which, even when controlled for income, is tied to low birth weight, obesity, cardiovascular disease, lower life expectancy overall. It is one of the most important factors in deciding measures of infant mortality. With regard to the environment, a recent 6-year study analyzing data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, Labor Statistics, and the EPA found a significant racial gap between who causes air pollution and who breathes it. So whites experience approximately 17% less air pollution than they produce, though through consumption, while Black and Hispanic populations bear 56 and 63% more air pollution than they cause, respectively. People of color are continually closer to environmental health hazards like pollution, like radiation, which are tied, as we know, to significant increases in cancer, miscarriage, neonatal disorders, and asthma, just to name a few. In fact, race, more so than socioeconomic status, is the best predictive variable in determining the placement of a toxic landfill in this country. In sociologic literature, these areas are known as fence line communities or sacrifice zones. And to me, that itself speaks volumes. What does it mean to be an individual who has been sacrificed? What does it mean to be a population or a person that your sovereignty has been willing to sacrifice? This is from an old Humans of New York post. It says, researchers can determine your life expectancy based on the closest subway stop to your house. That's not due to genetics. That's not because the breadbasket of America is running out. That's because of how we choose to divide our resources, and I think it defines our character as a society. The issue of health inequity revolves around central ideas of power. These ties among mass incarceration, space, education, and economic capacity are immense. The axis of race runs through these facets of life to mix and create unique hostilities that build upon and within each other. Segregation exposes communities to hyperpolicing, which is tied to fine farming. DOJ investigations of the Ferguson Police Department found that 85% of traffic stops targeted Black residents. Municipal violations for having unmowed lawns or misplaced trash were issued overwhelmingly to Black residents. 95% of citations for, quote, manner of walking in the roadway were issued to Black Americans. What does this mean? It means money. Now, about a quarter of African American families in the United States have less than $5 in reserve. In Ferguson, the fine for high grass and weeds is $531, 102 for misplaced trash, 302 for manner of walking violations. What does this mean? It means that the poorest and most vulnerable are subsidizing their municipalities. They are the ones paying for revenue gaps created by corporate tax abatements. They are paying for government debts. They are being forced into predatory loans and high-risk borrowing that we know are both financially devastating and racially discriminatory. We have to conceptualize racism not only as an interpersonal phenomenon characterized by slurs or discrimination, but also as a set of overarching practices that devalue and disadvantage people of color at multiple levels of society. What becomes clear then is that race certainly matters, but what matters more is how you talk about race and how you think race matters. The issue here is that framing race as biologic reifies the idea that people of color are innately different. And it implies that health disparities are due to internal racial flaws that are only solvable with genomic technology. This diverts attention away from larger realities of social inequality and the need for social rather than scientific interventions. In a recent NIH biannual report to Congress, the words genome, genomic, and genetic were used a total of 556 times. In comparison, a search for other words such as social determinants of health, discrimination, poverty, socioeconomic status, racism, and sexism only came up a total of 15 times across 441 pages. If the words are not there, then the attention is absent. This is incredibly important when we look at where our resources are going. From 1994 to 2005, more than 22,000 NIH grants funded research on genetics and race. In that same decade, only 44 grants were awarded to research on racial discrimination or racism. This is a 500-to-1 ratio of spending difference that pays attention to race rather than racism. I almost always cite this statistic because I think it illustrates one of the more insidious but significant detriments of genomic race research. You can argue that information is valuable, but we have to be careful to realize that mining this data is not always harmless or without cost. I think this ties directly to issues around knowledge production and resource allocation. It ties directly to how we think about solutions. Recently, a $12 million grant was awarded to investigate biologic and genetic factors that contribute to breast cancer in Black women. And that's not to say that that isn't important, but there are many other complex issues that merit our attention as well. In fact, there was really fascinating research coming out that demonstrates an increase in breast cancer incidence in Black women born in Jim Crow states. So here, Jim Crow, as a legally sanctioned infrastructure that codifies discrimination, has clear impacts on health and wellness, but not due to innate conceptions of race. Social context creates race-based consequences, but not due to essential biology. So how do we get studies like this funded? I think this is particularly concerning given our political climate at this time. The 500-to-1 resource allocation implies that solutions for racial health disparities lie in the investigation of racial genetics. But the next time you read a study that makes claims on clinical efficacy or health disparities based on the biology of race, I think it's really important to question the facts that are being presented to you. Think about how pinning health inequity on genomic differences is in the best interest of those in power, and it serves as a diversion from bigger issues. Systems, in addition to people, create healthcare disparities. But the idea that race is intrinsic not only echoes eugenic theory, it diverts culpability and responsibility from society and its larger structures down to individual people, which creates a very myopic view. It is impossible to understand the landscape if we whittle down these massive inequities down to differences in personal genomics. To me, this pervasive framing is heavily implicated in the ways that biologic assumptions of race are operationalized and ingrained in medicine. In a 3- and 5-month sampling of first and second year preclinical curriculum at the Warren Alpert Medical School, a full 96% of lecture slides presented racial signifiers as explicitly or implicitly biologic in association with healthcare disparities. So, for example, calculations for organ function, including lung function measured through spirometry, advocate for race corrections, which is a concept that relies heavily upon the idea that people of different races are biologically different and therefore require correction, usually from a white standard. While this concept is highly contested in scholarly disciplines outside of medicine, discussion of race corrections in medical education often fails to include necessary context. Spirometry, for example, is often taught without consideration of its development, use, or accuracy, despite the fact that it was historically used to justify slavery. Prestigious medical journals of the time posited that this lower lung function actually meant slavery was integral to keeping Black people healthy. You can see the arrow pointing to a tab denoting race built into the machine itself so that it automatically adds a race correction to the produced report. This practice is not benign. The utilization of race correction in spirometry changes the threshold for diagnosis and disease, which has resulted in lower rates of eligibility for disability support in Black Americans. Using current algorithms for predicted lung function, 60% of white workers and 81% of Black workers listed in the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health would qualify for compensation. When applied without the race adjustment, that number becomes 94% of the Black workers that would qualify for compensation. This harm was recently repeated in NFL concussion settlements, in which race-corrected neurocognitive exams prevented Black football players from qualifying for payouts as high as $3 million. And in both of these cases, when atavistic race corrections are applied, Black patients go from being eligible for diagnosis and support to being ineligible. Glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, is another calculation that includes a race correction as well as a sex correction. In the lab, the kidney function of Black patients is inflated by 21%, which is damning given the significant racial disparities in morbidity and mortality of kidney disease. Again, this is a huge issue. GFR of less than 20 is required to qualify for a transplant list, and inflated function means that Black patients don't get put on the list until it's too late. Transplant nephrologists at my institution have told me that they will tell their patients who are hovering around this mark to get their creatinine tested if they drink too much coffee, if they have some episodes of diarrhea, because that small bit of dehydration can tip them into a GFR less than 20, which they can use to get them listed. All they need is one calculation, one proof of evidence that it's less than 20, and they can use that as evidence that they're ready to be listed. And that to me illustrates how significant an inflation of 21% is. 15 people die while waiting on the kidney transplant list every day. On average, 9 of those dead will be Black. Thousands of candidates are removed from the transplant list every year because they've become too sick to receive an organ. So it really is critically advantageous to get listed early. In 2019, Black patients represented 32% of the wait list, but only received about 21% of transplants. In comparison, white patients made up 36% of the list, but received more than half. So roughly, Black patients are getting 65% of their proportional share, while white patients are getting 150%. This animation is from a paper of mine. I think it really illustrates the damage that's done when you change an entire diagnostic and treatment threshold for Black Americans in clinical nephrology. So using population data, my team and I found that if the MDRD eGFR race adjustment were removed across the country, around 3.3 million more Black Americans would reach a diagnostic threshold for stage 3 chronic kidney disease. 300,000 more or more would qualify for nephrology referral, which has been shown to improve mortality and morbidity outcomes. And 31,000 more would become eligible for transplant evaluation and waitlist inclusion. Since then, there have been new changes in organ transplant policy that have really proved these projections to be true. So between January of 2003 and June of 2025, 22,000 Black kidney transplant candidates received wait time modifications, gaining a total of more than 51,000 person years of waitlist time. This resulted in a median gain of 1.7 years. It resulted in about 5.3 additional transplants per 1,000 Black candidates listed, with no evidence that improving access for Black patients reduced transplant rates for others. This is a picture of Jordan Crowley. He is a biracial 22-year-old who was born with one kidney. He was born with knowing that he would eventually need a kidney transplant to survive. And I met him and his family in Buffalo, New York, when I was writing a story on him for Slate. When Jordan was a child, he was evaluated for the kidney transplant list, but told that the computer was having trouble because they didn't know what race he was. At the time of his evaluation, his eGFR was 18. So as a white child, he could have qualified and started accruing allocation points. But as a Black child, his eGFR was calculated to 21 and his registration was not permitted. His doctors decided that he was Black. And his grandmother told me that she drove him to 3 different hospitals to see if anyone would treat him as white and put him on the wait list, but they all refused. We know that men who begin dialysis between the ages of 20 and 24, as Jordan is on track to do, on average will only live until they're 38 or 42. But a 20 to 24-year-old who receives a kidney transplant can expect to live for 44 more years, more than double and long enough to collect Social Security. For Jordan, or as he's known online as Dog Lover Jordy, that might mean 26 additional years to foster injured puppies, 26 more years to pursue his dream of being a counselor for children. He is the main and primary caretaker for his grandmother. He does all of her insulin shots multiple times a day. He cooks her meals. He and his grandmother are really sweet buddies. Like they are best friends. And 26 more years for him makes the difference to such a degree that I think it's really important to remember that these are not just about technicalities or laboratory formalities. There is real harm and human suffering attached to these practices. I do think these issues really come back to medical education. For decades, doctors and X-ray technicians were explicitly taught and thus believed that radiation doses for African Americans should be increased because their bones were harder and denser, their skin darker, and their flesh tougher. This practice caused an innumerable amount of disease and damage and included a series of horrible radiation experiments on unknowing Black patients. But this practice was not explicitly outlawed by the New York State Health Department until the late 1970s. And in case you believe that this kind of thinking is a historical artifact, a study from the University of Virginia published in 2016 indicated that a significant number of medical students and physicians still believed in fundamental biologic differences between whites and Blacks, including that their nerve endings are less sensitive, that Black skin is thicker, and referring back to spirometry, that whites have a more efficient respiratory system than Blacks. So this is not ancient history. These ideas persist and pervade today. In this series of slides, one lecture discussed the same concept of hemolytic anemia, but conflates Black and African. Black refers to Black skin phenotype, which includes all nationalities and upbringings, as well as geographic origins from sub-Saharan Africa, the Afro-Caribbean, Middle East, and Latin America. Black race does not represent a homogeneous population. Research shows, for example, that the MDRD race correction does not improve the accuracy of EGFR for Black populations outside of the United States. Barack Obama's mother is from Kansas. His father is from Kenya. At his local hospital, his kidney function might be corrected, even though that the presupposed genetic risk for kidney disease is a West African allele, which Obama is at no risk of having. Um, of note, between 1988 and 1990, the Center for National Health Statistics changed its policy from saying that the race of a child is dictated by the race of their mother to saying that the race of a child is dictated by the race of their father. So because of this, you could argue that Barack Obama's race, as other people's race, was changed from white to Black in the late 20th century. Tools like the ASCVD risk calculator ask if a patient is white, African American, or other, but is African the same as Black, the same as African American, the same as Nigerian? In academic and clinical medicine, we rarely know exactly what we're talking about when we mobilize these labels of race. A review of NIH genetics research between 2001 and 2004 found that 0 manuscripts defined their use of race or ethnicity. Not a single author articulated what they meant or how they understood race, even as they studied it. I think this speaks so clearly to how normalized and unquestioned biologic racial difference has become in biomedicine. I really cannot think of another context in which a scientific paper can fail to define a major scientific or major research variable and still get published without a problem. In multiple education material for medical school, race has been listed as a risk factor for a variety of pathologies, including pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections. This is a resource from the AAFP, American Academy of Family Physicians. It says risk factors for unprotected intercourse and thus pregnancy include difficulty obtaining contraceptives, less than a college education, age 20 to 24 years, and Black race. The next picture is from the USPSTF, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, which recommends different clinical practice depending on these risk factors with no further explanation. So being viewed as Black is in itself enough to qualify you as at risk for STIs, meaning doctors should routinely do STI testing when they otherwise would not. I found another example of race-based medicine in pretest pediatrics. This is a recommended resource for medical students. I use this in medical school. A well-appearing Black infant is noted to have fifth finger polydactyly. The extra digit has no skeletal duplications and is attached to the rest of the hand by a thread-like pedicle. What is the appropriate treatment? The answer states fifth finger or post-axial polydactyly is 10 times more common in Black than in white children and is typically familial. This finding in an otherwise healthy Black child should raise no special concern. In a white child, careful examination of the cardiac system is warranted. So it goes on to note that some of the syndromes associated with polydactyly are Rubinstein-Taybi syndrome, Becker-Grubel syndrome, and Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome. Consequences which include fatal reactions to anesthesia, leukemia, lymphoma, kidney and liver and lung dysplasia, ASD, dwarfism. These are things that I don't think we should be deferring monitoring just based on skin color phenotype. A couple of other race-based treatment recommendations. Asian Americans should be treated with lower initial doses of antipsychotics due to increased side effects. The authors themselves postulate that this may perhaps be due to genetics, lower body mass, diet, or patient expectation of side effects. And when race is used as a proxy in this way, it's not thoughtful. Using Asian as a representation for all of these factors is actually pretty sloppy. We see that data of this kind of understanding of race does not align with ancestral alleles. If it's about body mass, we can look at body mass. If it's about expectations or diet, we can assess those directly. This is a lecture slide from my second year of medical school, where we were taught that African Americans are less responsive to ACE inhibitors and should be put on other medications first. This follows the hypertension guidelines from the Joint National Commission, the JNC8, which includes an algorithm that directly separates treatment recommendations for Blacks and non-Blacks. This also brings up Plessy's question from 1896. How Black do you have to be Black? But this time, instead of asking the courts, we are asking physicians to provide the answer. Internationally, African Americans suffer hypertension rates at 3.5 times those of Nigerians living in Africa. African Americans experience hypertension only 0.75 times the rates of presumably white Germans in Germany. From another study, rates of hypertension in Black individuals from Illinois are shown here compared to 5 countries of West African origin. So it's hard to explain these results using the theory that there is something about the genetics of African populations that predisposes them to hypertension. And instead, it poses this different question: which category matters more for a patient, country of origin or social status in the adopted nation? It seems that there's something about the United States, not African genetics or ancestry, that is at the source of hypertension disparities in America. In fact, research shows correlations between metrics of discrimination with rates of hypertension. I think this study is really interesting. In California, women with Arabic names who were pregnant in September 2001 in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks had significantly higher incidence of low birth weight compared to similar populations who gave birth in September of 2010. The incidence correlated with a threefold rise in anti-Middle Eastern hate crimes in California. And to me, it demonstrates that race, stress, and health are very much intertwined. Additionally, inaccurate biologic concepts of race without critical examination have negative clinical consequences. I would argue that due to board examinations, every US medical student of this generation is aptly familiar with race associations. And yet, repeated ideas on race associations can result in misdiagnoses or delayed treatment if patients present outside of the structured paradigm. There's this case study in which a young African American woman is in and out of hospitals for years, looking for a diagnosis for recurrent illness until a passing doctor sees her x-ray and asks, oh, who's the kid with cystic fibrosis? Because of the way cystic fibrosis is so often associated with white children, this patient lost years of early intervention. It wasn't until her race was effectively erased through radiographic film that doctors could assess her clinical picture more accurately. Here is a picture from Reddit: how I feel when doing UWorld, and the first line is an African American female. I have posed this before, and the audience can guess this literally just from that phrase, an African American female. This is a list I also found on the internet: Bigot Your Way to Success, Stereotyping for the USMLE, the US Medical Licensing Exam, How to Discriminate Your Way to the Top. I'm embarrassed to say that I know these. And unfortunately, if you don't already know these, if there are medical students in the audience, I think many of you will learn them in the course of your career, specifically because of board exams. And it really matters how students are taught. In 2013, a study provided physicians with clinical vignettes that included either biologic or social race association, and it found that mentioning a specific race-related genetic difference in a health outcome was enough to heighten several measures of racism. Another researcher noted that persons who accept genetic explanations for racial differences tend to score relatively high on traditional measures of prejudice. And so thinking of race as biologic can contribute directly to implicit bias in physicians. This has shown to manifest as differential expectations of adherence, noncompliance, risk for substance use. Social psychology research also shows that notions of biologic essentialism lead to greater racial animosity and decreased support or willingness to vote for efforts seeking to redress social injustice. And this makes sense. If you think it's an issue of genes, you're not really interested in voting for reparations or things that would help strengthen the social safety net. In a short story I was reading last year, I came across this line: they are like a different race, a different species. They seem not to experience pain the way that we do. So there is something within the public imagination that accepts fundamental biologic difference. And even though anesthesia had become available in the 19th century at the time when J. Marion Sims practiced surgical techniques on Black women, they were assumed to be impervious to physical pain and unafraid of surgeries because biological differences made them able to, quote, bear cutting with such impunity as dogs and rabbits. Even in recent times, Black patients are almost half as likely to receive analgesics in the emergency department for long bone fractures. They receive decreased rates of cardiac catheterization when they present to the ED with standard symptoms of heart attack. Black patients have lower rates of every type of organ transplant. And in fact, the only major surgical procedure that is more abundant in patients of color is limb amputation. if we are teaching race in ways that conjure, perpetuate, and increase bias, this is a serious thing to consider. And now, between delayed and unequal care, implicit bias, even beyond regarding the larger picture of racialized inequality, we are starting to see a bigger answer to this question. Why does being a person of color cause worse health outcomes? And again, what matters is how you talk about race, what you are trying to ask when you include race as a variable in your questions and research projects. Through what lens do you understand race causing health disparities? To make matters more complicated, it's important to mention that mandating racial categories in medical research was seen as a progressive achievement. At the same time, as we noted before, emphasizing difference, especially biologic difference, implicates the idea that people of color are intrinsically dissimilar. So we need to pay attention to race, but carefully. This is why I advocate for race-conscious medicine, which invalidates race-based medicine, but also explicitly rejects colorblindness as a solution. I think a quick way of summarizing this is to explicitly recognize race not as a risk factor, which is oftenly portrayed as a biologic variable that drives disease disposition, but as a risk marker which invites harm as a consequence of racism. There are two main takeaways I want to repeat. First, I think a lot of people get stuck on the idea of race being a social construct because they interpret this as implying that race is therefore made up. Being a social construct does not mean that race is unimportant, right? Race is not a unicorn. We know it's not a unicorn. It is indeed a category that is culturally engineered, but it is a category that is still meaningful and abundantly so, given the data that we see on the impact of racism. Additionally, saying that race is a political category rather than a biologic category does not mean it doesn't have impacts on biology and health. Diabetes, hypertension, myocardial infarction, these are all biologic, physiologic diseases caused by inequity. They are biological consequences to a social ill, even though race is a political idea. In medical school, I received a lecture on sickle cell, where I learned, as many of us know, that there are no lab results or tests that can objectively demonstrate that patients are experiencing a crisis. To diagnose it, you have to believe your patient when they say that they are in pain. At the end of class, our lecturer minimized her presentation. She stepped out from behind the podium for a last lesson, and it really stuck with me. She told us that she explicitly instructs her Black patients that no matter what kind of excruciating pain that they are in, before they go into the emergency department, they have to do two things. They have to shower and they have to dress as if they are headed to a job interview. She knows and she teaches them that their chance of receiving adequate pain management is significantly reduced if they do not do those things. So race is made up, but it's not a unicorn in the sense that it has very, very significant repercussions. Second, I want to reiterate that the way that we conceptualize race really does matter. It's not about technical definitions or squabbling over semantics. Being accurate about our comprehension of race and health inequity can save lives. And I think the stakes are very, very high. The first question of this presentation was, what is race? That question is important because race appears so often in front of these other words: disparity, inequity, inequality, and the way that we answer shapes our entire theories about the causes, the sources, and the solutions for sickness in this country. All throughout medical education and training, we are told implicitly and explicitly that race is genetic, it's innate, it's physiologic. This belief is very rampant in our house. But consider the alternatives. Chris Chen notes in his essay, The Limit Point of Capitalist Equality, on the one hand, race is a form of cultural stigmatization and misrepresentation requiring personal, institutional, and/or state recognition. On the other hand, race is a system of wage differentials, wealth stratification, and occupational and spatial segregation. If racial health disparities can be reduced to physiologic and genetic phenomena, then the answer to our ill health is relegated to technologic advancements in biologic interventions. We do not need the March on Washington or fair housing or the vote. We simply need pills, gene therapies, and maybe some diversity training after class. We do not need community activism. We simply can buy the products and services we derive from biomedical research. This was something that was really apparent to me during COVID with COVID literature, and it was extremely concerning to me. There were prestigious journals publishing things like this: racial and ethnic variation to nasal gene expression of TMPRSS2. There was genetic susceptibility for COVID-19 associated sudden cardiac death in African Americans. Racial variations in COVID-19 deaths may be due to androgen receptor genetic variants. This is really bad science. We know, even intuitively and also empirically, that American citizens with the same skin color as George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, they were dying and are dying from COVID at shockingly inordinate numbers. They face unequal access to testing, higher levels of underlying health conditions, lower rates of medical coverage, greater exposure because they are disproportionately frontline workers, janitors, incarcerated, and impoverished. Black bodies have been wounded and strained by decades of discrimination. Their lungs cough with asthma because they've been forced to live near highways and toxic landfills, because they've been targeted by the tobacco industry and the housing market. And these are the injustices that make them unable to breathe. These are the injustices that explain why in excess of hundreds of thousands of Black Americans have died because of COVID-19. But studies like this make racial genetics the explanatory scapegoats of this death, as if the egregious pandemic mortality in people of color is somehow justified by their genomes. The way that we ask and we answer our questions about health disparities changes where we locate culpability, blame, and anger. When you look at racial inequity, where do you see the flaw? When you look at health disparities, when you see this 100,000 person gap in survival between Black and white citizens of this country, do you really and truly believe it is because of innate Black failure? Recognizing racism as the linchpin of health inequity changes the conversation. The culprit is not difference, not genes, but supremacy. There is tremendous opportunity in medical training and practice to rectify problematic thinking about race, biology, and innate difference. I think a really compelling way to think about this comes from an article by one of my heroes, Nancy Krieger, who is an epidemiologist at Harvard School of Public Health. She asks, did child abuse exist before 1962, when C. Henry Kemp and co-authors published this now classic article, The Battered Child Syndrome? Of course, she says, of course that child abuse harmed health before then. But until we had a name for it, we weren't able to screen it, identify it, treat it, or care for its victims in a way that we could document and monitor it in a rigorous and scientific and institutional sense. In the same way, I think naming racism gives us purchase. The ability to recognize it offers a path for explicit investigation, and the identification of racism as an enemy of public health signals its deservedness as a recipient for major attention and resources. When we encode work, when we encode our education and our research as anti-racist, we conjure in our collective imagination a way to render the violence obsolete. So like child abuse, naming racism does not mean that it did not exist before. It's not novel to suggest that it existed before. But having this name and having this identification means that the serious scientific study of racism can begin. And we in academic medicine have really the opportunity to change the fact that it's still in its infancy. At the beginning of this presentation, I offered a quote from Medici's Americana. What's the deal, doctors in the house? Is race an invention or not? She asks this and directs the question to us because we are expected to know. I am passionate about this subject and I am passionate about medical education in this sense because I really, really believe it matters. I think it sets the stage for our understanding of justice and our chance for freedom for both ourselves and our patients. I am going to stop there. Hopefully, I think there's still good time for questions. Here is a quick summary slide with recap points as well as some of my contact information. Please feel free to reach out with questions. I am especially grateful anytime there is feedback. I'm always trying to improve. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tsai, for that really thought-provoking presentation. So, given the focus on medical education, let me start with a question about recent events. So I'm sure you are aware that a major U.S. accreditation group, the Liaison Committee on Medical Education, or LCME, has removed language in its standards that recommended that medical schools teach about health inequities or health disparities. I know from reading your writing that you have strong views about the differences between health disparities and health inequities, and I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about that difference and then talk about the potential impact of the that LCME decision.
Yeah, I heard about that too, and I think it's really disappointing. I think technically one of the distinctions between health inequities and health disparities by definition is that when we think of health disparities, we think about a difference. So a way to think about that is there are disparities between men and women in rates of cervical cancer. That is because most people who identify as men do not have cervixes. So there is a disparity in these rates because of difference. When we think about something as a health inequity, we are immediately implicating an injustice, an inequality of the distribution of resources. And so if we talk about different rates of cervical cancer because of healthcare access, because of health literacy, because the ability of testing or the cost of testing, those become health inequities, not just health disparities. So understanding and having terms that immediately implicate that there is injustice involved, again, goes back to conceptualizing where the blame is, how they're created, and understanding how they're created determines how we consider solutions. There is no way, I honestly do not know how we will address things if we cannot begin to conceptualize things as healthcare inequities. Taking it out of the curriculum or making it disallowed or actually punished to talk about them in this way means we're completely hampering our ability to even imagine solutions. And I think it's really dangerous. It's again, it's not just a question about semantics, but the ways that we're actually able to pursue and consider ways to create our to make our problems smaller.
Thank you. Um, So then there's a question in the Q&A about sort of the asking you to talk a little bit more about, and I think this connects to the issue about health inequities, about the role of social structure in all of this. I know you did talk about this some just now in your response to the first question and also in your talk. But if you would expand a bit on sort of that distinction and sort of capture the idea a little more about how we might better educate around the role of social structures in the production of those inequities.
Um, you know, there is a social medicine program in North Carolina where every one of their classes was taught. I honestly don't know if they've continued to teach it this way, but every one of their courses in social medicine is co-taught by a physician and a PhD in sociology or anthropology, medical history. Um, and it's about having a diversity of perspectives and being able to train critical thinking. We are inundated with so much biomedical knowledge in medical school. There are certainly reasons for that, but it trains us to think in a very certain way. It trains us to think about race in a very certain way. It trains us to think about risk and social variables in a certain way. And I think this is part of, one of the other questions in the Q&A is about, it's hard. It's really hard to teach about social structures and inequality because they're
Yeah.
thorny for social reasons.
Mhm.
They're hard to measure for research. They're hard just in terms of interpersonal discussions. One thing that I think about is in my first week of medical school, I started the curriculum and I sat next to a classmate who had a PhD in um, biology, specifically around biochemistry, and we were learning about amino acids. And I had a history, I had taken pre-med courses, but my coursework had been in ethnic studies and American studies. And we were asked and we were expected to learn the same material about amino acids. And I took the same test as he did. If we encode it as a requirement and as a compelling and important element of physician education, you expect your students, you expect your trainees to be able to grasp those concepts, and you devote resources to gaining those teachers. I also think about how in different advocacy points during med school, we would talk about this, and the administration in a supportive way would say, this was not part of our curriculum growing up. And so we would actually really appreciate if you help us, if you create some presentations that we can use in our curriculum committees, give us a little bit of knowledge that we can kind of incorporate into some of our lectures to other students. And I just thought that if there were an issue with like the anatomy curriculum, about a fundamental issue with the anatomy curriculum and how we were getting our anatomy curriculum wrong, they would never rely on the volunteer PowerPoints of first and second year medical students to address that issue. They would hire PhDs.
Yeah.
They would hire people who teach anatomy. They would hire the scholars that exist to do this. And so they were being supportive in a way, and they were being open and empathetic in a way, but it still encodes a certain kind of um, dismissal. The last thing that I'll say is something that I think about often is like, yeah, it's hard. And we also figured out how to 3D print livers. Like, we have done a lot of hard stuff. We can do it. We can do hard stuff. We have chosen to do very, very hard things. We have proven we can do very hard things. And so, yeah, it's hard. We can do it. I know we can.
I love that optimism. Let me ask you just a couple of more questions, because we're a bit over time at this point, but I really want to make sure we have a chance to get to some of these. There's an interesting question in the Q&A about the role that race played in the algorithm for prioritize access to the vaccine in some locations. Specifically, the question relates to in New York during COVID, right? And for those of you who are not familiar, I believe that what the questioner is referring to is the idea that um, race was taken into consideration um, in determining what priority individual patients ought to have for access to the vaccine in those early days of vaccination when we were having to ration or offer prioritized access. Um, I wonder if you might comment on that. It's sort of the flip side of all the sort of more implicit, we're going to use genetic bases um, um, to deprioritize folks based on their race. And I wonder if you just might comment on that distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes back to something that I advocate for is race conscious research or race conscious algorithms.
Mhm.
I think it's very dangerous to move towards color blindness as a solution, to say, actually, we just like won't consider race at all because it's discriminatory to include race. We actually know that there are all sorts of routes of discrimination and inequality. And so muting ourselves or choosing to follow color blindness doesn't actually help. I think it's, of course, important to think about language, to think about, uh, again, the ways that you're explaining and rationalizing using race. If you say we should prioritize Black patients for race because we think that there's a genetic variable that makes them particularly susceptible, I don't think that's a good reason. It's not scientifically validated. If you say we have data specifically in New York City as we're rolling out the vaccine, that there are huge disparities based on who is able to access the vaccine or who is interested in the vaccine or which populations are struggling or going behind on vaccine rates, and this is actually a public health initiative and endeavor to address those inequalities, then I think paying attention to race does make sense. I think it's tricky, but I think it really comes back to how you're able to rationalize and how you're able to be careful about why you're using certain variables and what you intend to change with those.
Thanks. Last question. And I'm just going to say in advance, there are a lot of really great questions here, and I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to get to them all. But a number of people have asked the question, as they often do, attendees to these webinars, what can individuals do? I know you've made some recommendations about alterations in medical education, and the ways that clinicians should think about race. The folks here who may be medical professionals or nursing professionals, or public health folks or whatever, often want to know what can I, as a health professional, do in my practice to address the kind of questions that you're raising here. Do you have recommendations or advice for people?
Yeah, I think my first reaction or response, I could imagine that it could be dissatisfying, but it feels really true for me. And it's to pay attention and to refuse to let these things slide into normalcy. We just every day in the hospital see incredibly violent and hostile realities to our healthcare system. And of course, as anything else, it's easy to get desensitized to it or think that they cannot change or will not change or that they're a normal part of any healthcare system. And I think that's really sad. And I think that's really dangerous for everybody involved. I honestly think one of the best ways to start pushing back is to refuse to see that as normal. I think something that relates to that is to find yourself a community that helps you believe that it's abnormal and helps you remember that it's abnormal because it's really hard to maintain that and to kind of keep that candle lit by yourself. There is, of course, something to be said about how can I change practice in my own hands. I think there's certainly a lot about consciousness, about critical thinking, about questioning when race-based medicine is trained in you or given to you as a tool. I also think realistically, we know that change does not happen from individuals. And the power that we have as individuals just is not nearly as powerful as it is within a community. And my real recommendation is to find a community where you can start building this resistance in a way that is sustainable. I think all the time about a talk that I went to about reproductive justice in Georgia. And one of the panelists said, fighting Nazis should be fun. And I think about that all the time. This work can be really hopeless. It can feel like engaging with a lot of despair. And I think the best way to fight against that is to make fighting Nazis fun. So if that means for me finding community where we do this work and somebody brings a box of wine, or we send each other messages when we're going through hard times that are full of joy and like hilarity. And we build these sustainable ways so that we can continue to do this in a way that feels enlivening and feels contributory rather than really draining. I don't mean to say that that's easy. I think that's incredibly difficult. Um, but if I'm honest, I think it's the most important way to start.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful way to finish today. So I really want to thank you for joining us and for sharing your work. Before we go, I want to let our attendees know about upcoming events. So on June 2nd, we have one of our clinical ethics webinars on ethical issues around organ donation. The speaker will be Joel Wu from our faculty. And then on August 18th, Jason Wasserman is going to join us, another clinical ethics webinar. He's going to talk about slow codes and show codes, titled To Be Determined Yet. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. And finally, fall semester courses being offered by the Center for Bioethics here. Dr. Kahneman Cease and Professor Wu are going to teach our biomedical ethics. That's a sort of general survey of bioethics issues at the professional and graduate level. Dr. Needle Suarez and I are going to team teach a course on social justice and bioethics. And we do welcome non-degree or visiting students who meet course prerequisites in those courses. So please feel free to take a look at the course information and register or contact us if you have questions. Let me one more time thank you, Dr. Tsai, for joining us today and for that really beautiful presentation. I know you have given folks an awful lot to think about, and I'm thankful that so many people were able to attend and participate. And sorry again, we couldn't get to all the questions. Thanks a lot, everybody. Hopefully, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.